I think from a bodybuilding perspective right now, there is a renewed focus on let me try to get to the longest muscle length possible. And I do worry a little bit that might be at the expense of what is biomechanically sound from a joint position perspective, especially considering that we're also trying to then match up the exercises where the highest torque is at the point when your muscle is most elongated, right? So we're finding movements like, let's say, a heavy dumbbell fly, an RDL, or any movement you can think of where the load is highest when the muscle is longest, and therefore the joint is near its end range position. And then spending more time in that position than we would throughout the full range of motion. And not that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, it's probably good from a hypertrophy perspective, but I think it is just something we need to be aware of, that because this is a novel idea, semi-novel, that people are maybe jumping into this with higher volumes at higher loads and at faster paces than would probably otherwise be advised if we were just thinking about this from the perspective of, all right, this is a new few degrees of range of motion that I have. How would I start overloading this in a way to make sure that I have the tissue preparation for it? Like if Nick was going to go, oh, okay, so we want to increase our range of motion on presses by 10 degrees, he probably wouldn't be like, sweet, grab the heaviest weight you can do for 8 and then just do the bottom portion to failure. Like that would not probably be, I'm guessing, Nick, your recommendation. So I think it's important to understand that what is necessarily optimal from a hypertrophy perspective is not necessarily something that you can jump right to without a little bit of preparation, I probably is the word I would put. So Nick, I would love to get your thoughts on that. Am I off base? Do you agree? Are you at all concerned with some of the narratives around this and the speed at which it's catching fire and interest?
I definitely am. Yeah, that's really, really well said. I think because it's something that is being talked about so much, and it seems like the barrier of entry is non-existent, it's, I think people may be diving in a bit too quickly. These are, whenever you're at an end range or a full lengthened position, you want to go there gingerly. Think about like a leg extension, and you hear about muscle length and you say, okay, cool. So instead of doing my leg extensions on my home gym bench press with a leg extension attached to it, how about I just lie down flat and bang out some more reps? And then you get into the full lengthened position, and all of a sudden your rectus femoris rips off your pelvis and you have a tear up high. So I think, yeah, like you said with the bench press example, we're not going to just slam into these end ranges with heavy load. You want to really work into them slowly. If we're talking about a fly, maybe we start with like a floor fly on the floor, so you have a stop on the floor to prevent your to prevent you from really going in too much of a stretch. Load that, maybe do partial range in that range motion, and then maybe elevate yourself off the floor a bit, and now you can go down maybe like 3 inches further than you did. Then maybe you work up to a bench or a machine where it's more controlled and you're not using free weight dumbbells that are harder to kind of proprioceptively like see where you are in space. If you're on a fly machine, that's probably even better than starting on the floor. Just set the stops on the fly machine to a certain point and gradually work back into those points, into those ranges of motion. Another great way to kind of gradually expose yourself to those points are isometrics. So maybe you do your normal training, your traditional training, how you've been doing it and your body's adapted to. And then once you're done with your sets, then you bring the pins all the way back, get in that fully stretched position and just kind of hang out there. And then when I say isometric, I'm not talking like a full press into this thing. You're gradually ramping up. So set the weight to something really, really high so it won't move. And then just kind of hang out there and then think like 25%, 50%, 75, 50%, 25, relax. So you're kind of ramping up that isometric contraction in that lengthened position, and you're assessing each time you do it. If you feel any discomfort, you can always back off. If it seems like it's getting uncomfortable with the more of a percentage that you press with, like of your max, then okay, maybe we need to hang out the 25 to 50% effort at this point and then work back up to it. If it just hurts to sit here, then maybe we lessen the range of motion, and maybe the range of motion is a bit too much for that exercise. So yeah, I think ramping up to those ranges is really, really important. But that goes for anything too. So if we think of something like Brian, I can't believe you mentioned this. It just blew my mind. But that the knees can travel over your toes. I mean, number one rule of physical therapy, doctor. I mentioned I was a doctor, I think. But number one rule in doctor school is never let your knees go over your toes. Joking, obviously. But something like a split squat, like a rear foot elevated split squat or Bulgarian split squat. Yes, a nice front leg going calf to hamstring would be awesome. But if you're not used to that, then don't just fall into that position and expect to come up without any discomfort. So yeah, that would be awesome if you can hit that depth, let your knees travel over your toes for sure, but you want to work into that nice and gradually. Things like having a support, like a chair or something next to you. If we're talking a split squat, you can guide yourself down into that range. So get to the point where you're comfortable and then hold on and kind of go down a bit more. I'm a big fan, kind of like with the fly example, of doing your working sets, getting your training stimulus, getting your volume in, and then afterwards working on some of these exposure sets where you're not really counting them for volume. It's more just to kind of get the muscles and joints exposed to the ranges of motion. So say you do your normal split squats, going to about 90 degrees of knee flexion. Great, you loaded it up, you took it close to failure. Beautiful. Now that we're done, now we drop the weights and we're just using body weight and we have a good arm support on something and we're just kind of going deeper than we're used to. Just kind of exploring that space and then kind of assessing, just like with the fly example, is this a depth thing? Does my body weight just seem like too heavy? Do I have to unweight my body with my arms? Is it a stability thing? Like once I get to that depth, am I just getting a little shaky? So then you're kind of being a detective as you go into these new ranges of motion. And the more that you do that, the more your body will adapt to it. And then the more you can load it. And then eventually those exposure sets can kind of bleed into your working sets. But yeah, I think that is probably the best way to frame these kind of lengthened position exercises. Is you don't want to just dive right in. You want to have at least some kind of exposure, be your own detective, assess what it feels like, and then gradually work those into your normal training.
Yeah, one thing that I found, because it's been about a year and a half that I've been playing with lengthened partials and focusing more on trying to increase range of motion on hypertrophy exercises, is that the argument for warm-up sets becomes much stronger. So some great examples for people who aren't even doing this, who will notice this. Like if you're doing like calf raises, rotary calf raises, standing calf raise, seated calf raise, doesn't matter. You'll notice on your first working set, if you didn't do many warm-up sets, that if you're trying to go all the way down, each rep can get a little bit deeper as you're increasing like your dorsiflexion range, like acutely, and the tissues go, oh, this is where you need me to be. And accomplishing that takes a few reps, you know? And I find if I just jump right into a working set of lengthened partial, full range of motion calf raises, like on a rotary calf machine, for example, I'll set it up and the plates are not touching on the first 5 reps. And then eventually it'll like clank and I need to actually change the adjustment for my body to alter to my new dorsiflexion range. And that's something obviously that is a very acute shift in, neuromuscular control and, where your body thinks your tissue is comfortable and able to produce force. So I think that's important. Another great example of this is RDLs. You'll notice that you can get a little bit closer to the floor, especially if you're maintaining the right joint mechanics and positions, which is definitely not the case in a lot of cases, which I'll talk about more in a second. So I think it's like the tissue preparation after your working sets, but also potentially doing more warm-ups as well, just to see where your body is at and actually acclimating it to those ranges are two things I echo what you're saying and recommend. Back to my previous point about the right actual biomechanical position. Sometimes the effort to get more range actually produces a joint compensation where you don't want it and you're not getting as much range as you think. A good example of this, and I've done this myself, is like when I'm doing a seated leg curl and then I try to like fold forward over the seated leg curl, I notice that I'm actually getting less stretch on my hamstring than if I just maintain normal lumbar lordosis, stand up straight and just kind of tilt forward a little bit, because I'm actually going into posterior tilt and taking stretch off the hamstring. But it looks and sort of kind of feels like, oh, I'm really stretching, but it's mostly in like my lumbar. And you see this all the time when people squat to depth when they don't actually have that range. Like the more you're getting that posterior tilt, there's actually a shortening effect on the hamstring, right? So that's not that we're trying to train the hamstring with the squat, but the point is that if you're trying to maintain tension on a specific muscle group, you want to make sure the tension is actually occurring there. So things like an RDL, things like a seated leg curl, things like where you're finishing and starting a bicep curl, you might feel like you're increasing range of motion, but what you're actually increasing is the distance traveled of the weight, but not necessarily the number of degrees of flexion or extension at the joint itself. And I think we have to remind ourselves that for bodybuilding, if that's the goal, is to train the muscle at a longer length, it's not to move the implement a further distance, then we need to be very aware of the joint mechanics specifically. And sometimes if you don't have great body awareness, the sensation of stretch is not something that is a reliable indicator of that. You should videotape it, send it to a coach, etc. And if you don't necessarily have the anatomical knowledge to do that or assess it, then this is probably something that you're not quite ready for without a little more preparation, not just physically, but also like mentally and doing your homework. You know CASM relatively well. You've incorporated some of these things on the bodybuilding side of getting yourself ready before exploring alterations to range of motion purposefully.
Yeah, no, I don't really have a whole lot else to add on that front. I agree with you on the seated leg curl. I think one thing, and this is with calves too, especially if you're doing like a donkey calf raise, anything where there's hip flexion, I think sometimes people mistake like nerve tension is muscular tension in a stretch there. So if you lean forward on a seated leg curl, like you might go into some posterior tilt and actually take some stretch off, but it might still feel like it's an increased tension like on the back of your knee. And so that's something that I've paid more attention to lately, and because I used to lean forward more than I do now, like kind of like you said. And yeah, I find it to be, it seems more effective in that regard. And I don't get discomfort like at the back of the knee, or if I'm leaning forward, but I'm like, flexing at the spine in order to do so. It's like you're not really lengthening the muscle any further.